Good day, ladies and gents, wherever you may be around the world, and welcome to this special stream on Winston Churchill and British power between 1900 and 1945. I'm happy to say I've got... Hang on, let me do my boomer tech. There you go, guys. Sorry. Right. Yeah, I'm happy to say that I've got a special guest this evening, Bo, who you will know as History Bro from the Lotuses and all the rest of it. Good evening, mate. How are you going?
Yeah, I'm good. Thanks for having me. Yeah, always fancy a little.
Yeah, last time we did a stream together, it was on Daughter of Albion's channel. It was a Trafalgar Day stream, I recall, and that was a few years ago now.
Many moons ago. Yeah, that was a good chat. That was a really good chat.
Yeah, no, it was an interesting stream. I think it's still around somewhere. And I've also got a guest from my Discord, Aaron Hook, who's been on my Splendid Isolation streams a couple of times. Has also got a pretty good channel on YouTube, which is mainly about criticism of films and stuff like, and books also, films and books. I think that's correct, Aaron?
Yeah, that's it pretty much. Mostly book criticism for the most part.
Yeah, I've noticed you do books, but you also do movie criticism as well, I believe, sometimes, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to just answer a super chat that someone sent us on Entropy that on my last stream, because you'll realize I'm waffling here, guys. It's to give people a chance to get onto the stream. I did get a super chat last week, but the guy obviously sent it after the stream was finished, and he asked me what I thought about the Russian Oreshnik missile. And I do actually have an answer to that. And what it is you need to go and look up Daniel Davis Deep Dive, the YouTube channel. And there you will find a video with Ted Postal, who is a MIT professor and scientist who's very much into missiles and all the rest of it. And if you go and look up that thing with Ted Postal, that's probably the most information you're going to find about the Russian Oreshnik missile anywhere on YouTube. So there you go. I will actually mention this when I do my stream tomorrow for Splendid Isolation. I will just so that the guy who sent the super chat, who is Chris O'Hanlon, realizes I didn't ignore him and I did answer him. So there we go. Anyway, without further ado, we shall get on to our subject for this evening. And the way I wanted to organize this is basically Churchill became an MP for the first time in 1900. So we'll cover 1900 to about 1914. Then we'll do 14 to 18. Then we'll do between the wars and then World War II. So 4 broad sections. I would argue that Winston Churchill did more than any other single man to reduce British power and destroy the British Empire in those 45 years. Just to give a little bit of background, Winston Churchill spent the 1890s doing soldiering mixed with war correspondent work. He was always very clear that he was never going to make the army his career. He was always just using it to get publicity so that he could enter Parliament. He was always quite honest about that. He was a brave soldier. I have seen people who criticize Churchill and sometimes say he wasn't brave. I'm sorry, that's not true. Churchill was undoubtedly personally brave. I've got no issues about that whatsoever. He fought on the northwest frontier of India, where he came in for a lot of criticism because he got himself a grey pony. And, only idiots got themselves grey horses in a land dominated by snipers. But Churchill wanted to be noticed. He also took part in one of the last British cavalry charges in the Sudan, Omdurman in 1898. But one thing you have to realize about Churchill's military career, he was a cavalryman, he was a hussar. is that he never personally commanded more than about 40 men, a troop of cavalry, which was about 40 guys. That was the most guys he had direct responsibility of commanding. All right, he was supposedly a battalion commander in World War I, but we'll come on to that. And he wasn't really, to be honest, any more than he commanded at Antwerp, although he laughed as if he did. Okay, so Churchill enters Parliament as MP for Oldham after becoming famous for escaping from the Boers. Now, he was captured in the armoured train incident. I've actually been to the place in Natal where he was captured. There's a little monument there and the graves of a few of the soldiers who were killed. He was captured by the Boers on an armoured train, which had gone too far forward and got ambushed. And then he escaped from them. And this made him very famous because the Boer War was not going particularly well for the British at that time. And so this young officer escaping became much bigger headlines than it otherwise would have done. And Churchill was able to use that to become the MP for Oldham. One of his first major speech in Parliament in the middle of the Anglo-Boer War was against a proposal by the British Secretary of State for War to expand the British Army to 6 corps, which would have been 12 divisions. And Churchill made an impassioned speech against this, very much along the lines of the speeches his father made against British defence spending. But this is in the middle of the Anglo-Boer War. And the Anglo-Boer War, 1899 to 1900, was much the biggest and most expensive war that Britain fought between the Battle of Waterloo and the First World War. So it was a major campaign, and Britain was definitely short of troops, even with Empire contingents coming from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, etc. Britain was short of troops in this war because South Africa is a bloody big country. You know, I lived there for 15 years and I do know this. But yeah, Churchill totally against this. And that was his first major speech in Parliament. I'll hand this over to my guests to talk about that.
You go, Aaron.
Yeah, on this I agree with Drew completely about the speech. It's utterly ridiculous that you would make such a speech in the middle of a war, which, as Duke says, was the biggest commitment Britain had between Waterloo and the First World War. And it comes down to the fact that Churchill, John Chalmley, the historian, once contrasted Churchill with his friend F.E. Smith, where he said Churchill was a conservative because he happened to grown up in a family of conservatives, whereas F.E. Smith was an Aboriginal conservative. And so when Churchill is making that speech against the expansion of the army, part of the reason I'm a bit fuzzy on this, but correct me if I'm wrong, Duke, part of the reason he criticises that is due to social reform. He wants spending elsewhere. That's right.
I think he wants spending elsewhere, but I really haven't seen a good reason why he was against expanding the British Army in the middle of a big war. I haven't found a good reason for that. Churchill was very able to compartmentalise his thinking, so that if he was a defence minister, say he was the Minister for War or he was the First Lord of the Admiralty, then he would be in favour of spending money. But if he became the Chancellor of the Exchequer, he was the complete opposite, and just seemed to totally forget about his experiences as Minister of War or First Lord of the Admiralty. Just seemed to forget about it totally. So yeah, there's that.
Yeah. Sorry. No,
carry on.
I was just going to say that argument for spending on social reform, which from where I've read seems to be one of the motivations, does seem to be Churchill trying to live up to his father, because of course that's part of the reason why Lord Randolph Churchill tries to stop those defence spending in the 1880s, and ultimately he resigns from Salisbury's government. Sort of threatens to resign from Salisbury's government because of that, and obviously Salisbury accepts his resignation. So I do think part of the explanation for Churchill's speech there you can put down to him obviously trying to live up to his father's reputation and his father's memory. So I think throughout this we might want to remember that Churchill throughout his career is always thinking of his father.
Oh, for sure. I mean, yes, I totally accept that. And I mean, of course, Churchill's father's career was cut short because he died of syphilis. You know, I was watching a video about Winston Churchill last week, which is part of the reason I decided to do this stream. And it was the usual Boomer Truth regime guff about Churchill. And of course, they didn't mention why his father died young. They just said he died young. Well, he died young because he caught syphilis. So, you know, but even his father's anti-defense spending, and in his father's case, it was mostly spending on the Navy that he was trying to stop. And that was at a time when the British government was trying to build up the Royal Navy in the face of an increasing Russian naval strength. So, yeah. The next thing that we need to know about Winston Churchill, also, I should have said this right at the start. Churchill himself said when he entered politics that had it not been for Irish Home Rule, which the Liberals, of course, supported, he would have joined the Liberal Party and not the Conservatives. Churchill himself said that. Churchill was never really a Conservative. He was a Liberal. The only reason he didn't join the Liberal Party is because they were in favour of Home Rule, although Churchill manages to hold his nose and get over that later on, as we shall see as we go into the stream. Now, the next thing I'd like people to notice about Winston Churchill is that he was against the first British Immigration Act, which was the British Aliens Act of 1905. Churchill was totally against this. And the Aliens Act was designed to restrict very poor immigrants coming into Britain who were obviously taking British jobs and increasing the price of properties in working class areas. I mean, this all sounds very familiar to us today, of course, because, you know, Britain is again having immigrants who are coming in and taking British jobs and pushing up the price of housing, etc. But in 1905, this was mainly aimed at Eastern European Jews, it has to be said. And Churchill was totally against this. Now, you will find some supporters of Churchill who will say that's because Churchill was a good guy. Well, I'm sorry. To me, you should put your own people before immigrants from overseas. So again, I'll pass this over to Bo and Aaron for comments.
Well, yeah, a number of things you guys have touched upon and hit on already. A number of very, very interesting things. I think before I sort of talk in any detail about his sort of parliamentary career and all that sort of thing, it is worth, I think, dwelling for a moment on a couple of things you guys have already said. So it's very easy, isn't it, when you look back at figures from history, to think of them as black and white, almost two-dimensional figures. The further back you go, the harder it is to avoid that. Someone like Genghis Khan, but for example, or Charlemagne or something. We've got very little detail. But Churchill, you know, is fully in the light of history, and it was a complicated figure. Now, if there were two camps, and you have to be in either the pro-Churchill camp or the anti-Churchill camp, I'm fairly firmly in the anti-Churchill camp. But having said that, I think if you really want to try and understand, you know what it's like when you've read enough biographies, when you're a biography reader. But when people are actual human beings, not someone lost in the mists of time like Socrates or Pericles, or as I say, Genghis Khan or something, but an actual man that lived in the 20th century and stuff. They're a complicated figure, and I'd like to try and get to like some of the psychology if I can, if it's not too
go for it.
Cheesy about. So, like, I remember Dan Carlin talking about one time, it really matters what's rolling around in people's heads. He happened to be talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis and people like Curtis LeMay and people that were egging JFK on to nuke people. Like, what was rolling around in their head? Well, they were veterans of the war, and they were young men in the First World War and stuff like that. It's really important. Like, I'm not sure how old Aaron is, but Iron Jig, we're we're 20th century people, right? I think you're a touch
Mhm.
older than me, but I was born in 1981, right? So I was a little kid all through the 80s. All my
Yep.
first formative experiences are the 1980s, right? I was a teenager all the way through the 90s. By the time the year 2000 ticks up, I'm already 19, knocking 20 years old, right? So all my foundation is the 20th century. Well, when you look at Churchill, he didn't die until the 1960s, and obviously most famous for his role in World War II, but he's a Victorian person.
Yes, he
right?
was born. He was
He's a
born in
Victorian person.
about
He's
1876, I think.
right.
He
I was
was-
74, was it? 76. Anyway,
yeah, somewhere around. He was
74.
born in the 1870s.
So right, by the turn of the century, he's in his mid-20s. He's like 25, 26. He's already a fully grown man.
Yes.
Right. So I think that's worth bearing in mind, because when you see what he does and how he thinks and how he behaves and things in the 1940s, for me, he feels like a man out of time. He still feels like a Victorian person walking around saying things and proclaiming things. And one of the things that often gets said about him is that by people when he was old, when he was middle-aged and old, people said there was something of the schoolboy about him. That he was schoolboyish in all sorts of ways. And I think that's true. That sort of late Victorian boy's own adventure stuff. There was this type of person. There's this type of like late Victorian person who thought that the whole world and all the dangers in it were just a giant sport. They honestly believe that. There were guys that honestly believed that, right? And the forfeit for playing that game and losing is death, right? That's how he talked about when he was out on the northwest frontier and when he was doing a lot of stuff in Omdurman and in Sudan, and even with World War I stuff. It's very, very like boys' own stuff, you know.
I think there's one thing that I would bring out about Churchill's military career. First of all, the first war he went to, which was the Spanish-American War in Cuba, he went purely purely as a newspaper correspondent. He also was a newspaper correspondent mainly in South Africa. And the other campaigns he did, the Malacan Field Force, which was the Northwest Frontier campaign, and the Sudan campaign, he wrote very successful books about both. And as I say, he made no bones about this, so I'm not criticizing him about this, but he made no bones that he was only using his British Army career as a means of, as he described it, beating his saber into a dispatch box in the House of Commons.
My favourite book of his is The River War, where that's all about. It's not very much. He does mention himself.
Yeah,
sorry,
that's the Sudan.
Yeah. He mentions himself a couple of times in passing, but it's basically all about the history of it. It's not really. It's not like an account of his.
Listen, I am never going to criticise Churchill as a writer of English. He was.
He's an excellent writer. He was
an excellent writer of English. And if you read the story of the Malacan Field Force or the River War, or indeed My Early Life, which he wrote about his early life, it's not totally honest, but it's a good book.
Well, that touches on something Aaron said about his father that I wanted to pick up on. That this is in the background the whole time. It seems that his psychology, until he was an old man, he was living in his father's shadow massively. There's one anecdote of when his son was fully grown and Churchill was an old man after he was Prime Minister the second time, I believe, he said something like, who would you bring to dinner? Anyone alive or dead? Anyone? And Churchill said, my father, of course. That's very telling, isn't it?
He says in My Early Life that he only had 2 or 3 reasonably long conversations with his father ever.
Yeah. It's a weird relationship to us, isn't it? Why would you idolize a man like that? But
Churchill was part of the aristocracy. He was he was the son of a younger son of the Duke of Marlborough, and his father was married to an American millionaire's daughter, Jenny Jerome, who I always describe as little better than upper class whore once Churchill's father had died. And to be honest, she was. Like when Churchill was able to get himself to these various campaigns around the empire, etc. The reason he was able to do that was his mother, who was very attractive, by the way, would go and see these generals and what have you, and say, "Oh, can you possibly get my son a posting?" And because she was a cute girl, the generals would turn around and say, "Yeah, okay, then we'll fit him in somewhere or another," and that's how he got those postings.
Well, the point I wanted to make, you mentioned that short sojourn he had to Cuba. Was it the very first time I think he saw any gunplay, and he was shot at, wasn't hit or anything, but there's like a sniper had a pot shot at him or something along those lines, and he wrote down something which also I think is very telling for the entire character of the man, which he didn't seem to particularly change his whole life. He said something along the lines of, and I am paraphrasing, like, what jolly fun. Now I can say I've been shot at. So that's very different to us, right? Or even like millennial young men today. We don't think like that, do we? Well, very, very few of us do.
Yeah, I used to be a soldier. I mean, if you're a soldier, I guess you do kind of want the enemy to shoot at you, not too accurately, of course, but it's you're
sort of making a point. Very few people these days, very few Zoomers volunteer for military service, do they?
Well, I can't blame them, because what would they be flying for? But yeah,
the thing is, using courage. The point I was trying to make, I suppose, is this public schoolboy thing that you're encouraged. He was encouraged, and he obviously lived this, dialed up to 10. The world was one giant playground, and dangerous things were just part of it. And if anything, you goad it on, and it goes for his own life, but also everyone else's life.
Yeah, there is an aspect of Churchill that he never grows up. Yeah, I think that's definitely true, Bo. You bring out a good point there.
So by the time he's still, like we say, when he enters Parliament, he's 25, 26. He's still a young man, isn't he? Still a boy, really. We're getting on old enough to say something like that, but you're still very young at that point. And
I'm a good deal older than you, though. I was born in 1965. I was born the same year that Churchill died, I believe. But yeah, it's that's all true. Aaron, did you have anything you wanted to add to that bit?
Yeah, actually, just to go to the 2 points that Bo's mentioned about Churchill's mentality. I remember Leo Amery in his diaries. For those who don't know, Leo Amery was a Tory MP. He was a friend of Churchill's, went to school with him, but he was critical of him, and he served as a Tory MP from 1911 to 1945. And during the wartime government, he was Secretary of State for India. And in his diaries, he describes Churchill as never having grown up from being the cavalry subaltern. And that was very much so. I very much agree about his mentality. He never changed from that sort of youthful public school view of the world. And also, I do think we mentioned his father, and you mentioned his mother, Duke. But I do think that he idolised them, but they really were terrible parents. I mean, you can read letters of Churchill writing back from, I think it's both his preparatory school and in Harrow, writing to them this is a boy of 10, 12, 14, 15, 16 years old, truly hating the situation he's in, and he's begging to see them, and his mother is responding back saying how he's treating her cruelly by the way he's writing the letters. And if you read the letters, there's nothing cruel in what he's saying. He's clearly a young boy who just wishes to see his parents more, and the parents clearly have little or no interest in him whilst he's at school.
Wasn't there one letter where he said, please, please, please let me come home for Christmas, please, I love you dearly, Mama, all that stuff, and she's like, no.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's horrible. I shouldn't laugh. It's horrible.
But I mean, let's remember, Churchill had brothers, 3, I believe, and they did not have such awful childhoods, according to their own accounts. And there's been some work done. I think it was Edward Dutton, the Jolly Heretic, did some good stuff on the headmaster of one of the schools that Churchill went to. And Churchill claimed that this guy used to beat him horribly and all the rest of it. And Ed Dutton has poured a bit of cold water on that. And Churchill was certainly, if we're going to be kind to him, in his writings, he was very inclined to exaggerate the truth. If we're going to be kind to him.
Absolutely, particularly about his early life, it seems.
Yeah.
Like weirdly making out he was less intelligent than he was. All sorts of kind of odd things. But the other thing is to remember, okay, it was his uncle was the Duke, right?
Mm-hmm.
So his uncle's the Duke. His father, I'm talking about his days at school now. And his father was had been in government and was a sort of a politician with sort of what we might say name recognition, just about. So he was sort of somebody. He was the son of a sort of an important person.
His father was Chancellor of the Exchequer for a little while.
Briefly, exactly. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So at school, of course, there would be a hierarchy. And he's quite high up, he's born in Blenheim Palace and things. But he's not in a direct line, but... Sorry.
But Churchill does some bloody silly things when he's at school. Yeah. Really stupid things, jumping out of 10-foot trees and silly nonsense that basically, if he got into trouble for that, you can kind of understand why.
Things that, again, I think, show you that he was of that, the adventure, go and do something crazily adventurous, like some sort of late Victorian novel cliche of a person, almost. Doing extremely dangerous things.
Well, his father was also very critical of Churchill when he went to Sandhurst, because if you passed out higher at Sandhurst, you got a good infantry regiment, and if you passed out lower, you got a cavalry regiment.
That's funny, isn't it? Most people think you're wrong when you say that. I've said that to a couple of people. They're like, no, that's not right. That's not right. The cavalry is much more prestigious. And I'm like, no. In the 1890s.
No, absolutely not. And there used to be a saying in the British Army that about a cavalry officer who was so stupid that even other cavalry officers noticed. So, that used to be a British Army saying, an officer's saying. It's not always true, of course. Not every cavalry officer was stupid, but in general terms, if you passed out high in your class in Sandhurst, you got a good infantry regiment, like the Rifle Brigade or 60th Rifles or whatever. And if you passed out lower, you ended up in the cavalry.
I think there was a letter.
Churchill's father was very critical of Churchill not managing to pass out high enough to go into the infantry, particularly because, of course, in those days, an officer was not able really to live on his pay. So and if you're a cavalry officer, you've got to have chargers and hacking ponies and much more expensive uniforms when you're in full dress. And Churchill's father was not best pleased by this.
There is a letter from Lord Randolph, like Winston, saying, "Father, I've passed out of Sandhurst. I'm an officer in the British Army now." And he's like, he's literally saying, like, "You're such a disappointment to me. You've always been a disappointment to me. Oh my God, just try and make the best of your life from this point on. What's left of it? Like, it's almost like that bad."
But also, his father was pretty sick by that point with syphilis, so you have to make some allowances for that, I suppose. Anyway, let's move on, because I want to try and keep this stream to not too much over 2 hours. The next most important point for Winston's political career is Imperial tariff reform. Now, to me, this is really important. I've done whole streams on this. Imperial tariff reform I think it was between 1906 and 1908 was the last chance to try and turn the old Commonwealth of the British Empire, and by the old Commonwealth, I'm talking about Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and back in those days, South Africa. It was the last chance to turn the old Commonwealth, which is really the white Commonwealth, to be honest, into something real. And the idea was you were going to bring in imperial tariff protections, which would be to the advantage of farmers and miners and people in the colonies, like Australia, Canada, New Zealand, etc., and also to British manufacturers and also manufacturers in the colonies as well. All of the other major nations in the world by this stage had very strong tariffs protecting their own industry and workers. So America, France, German Empire, Russia, etc., all had very strong tariff protections. So did most of the smaller countries like Belgium and what have you as well. Britain alone was still doing free trade in the early 20th century, even though our industry was gradually being out-competed by the Americans and the Germans, certainly. So imperial tariff reform was a final attempt to try and turn the British Empire into something more than sentiment and having the same monarch. If it had succeeded, I think there is a good chance we would have ended up with an imperial parliament that all of the old Commonwealth countries would have sent MPs to in proportion to their population. That would have covered defense and foreign policy, basically. And Churchill was totally against this. And it was the major reason for him crossing the floor to join the Liberal Party, which he said he would never do because they supported Home Rule in Ireland. But he held his nose and managed it. So yeah, to me, this is a big deal. If you were in favor of real British power, if you were in favor of the British Empire, imperial tariff reform was vital. And Churchill,
what were Churchill's rationales for standing so strongly against it then? What did he say?
Well, once again, he didn't really. He jumped on the bandwagon, which all of the Liberal Party did, of cheap food. He tried to claim that if we'd have brought in imperial tariff reform, it would have put up the price of food in Britain. It might have done marginally, but it wouldn't have much, because the only place that it would have really affected would have been food from America. Britain was already importing wheat and beef and mutton and lamb from around the empire. So Canada was a big wheat exporter to Britain. Australia was a big wheat exporter to Britain. New Zealand was big for dairy products, because don't forget, we had refrigerated ships by this time. And it was a scare tactic, basically. The fact that it was going to mean expensive food was a scare tactic, and Churchill totally jumped on that bandwagon.
Right.
I think I can sort of give you an idea why Churchill may have supported this.
Go for it, mate.
I think it's very much because he was a man of his time. Pretty much from the repeal of the Corn Laws in the 1840s up until when Chamberlain starts agitating for tariff reform during the latter half of the Boer War, free trade is the policy of the British Empire. And
just to interrupt you for a second, Aaron, it shouldn't have been. Britain should have got rid of free trade by 1880 at the very latest, because by that stage, both America and Germany were starting to impinge on British markets big time. But carry on, man.
Yeah, no, I agree, and of course that would have helped with getting Britain out of the Long Depression at the time. And so when Chamberlain starts doing his campaign for the imperial tariff, he does in fact split the Tory party, because Churchill is obviously the most extreme example of a Tory who switches party over the issue. But there are many Tories who oppose tariff reform.
Well, I wouldn't say many. I think many is an example. But there was a minority of Tories who were against it, but it wasn't a nothing minority, but it certainly wasn't a huge part of the Conservative Party. I
would say that there was significant opposition in the parliamentary Tory party, though the Tory membership very much favoured tariff reform. And
yes, they did. Yes, they did.
And I would argue that the opposition to tariff reform within the Tory party declines after 1905. And so the Tory party firmly becomes the party of tariff reform after that point. However, in the period where Churchill defects to the Liberals, the split is such that Balfour, the Prime Minister, will not go either way on the policy because he knows it will split the party.
Yeah,
so
the divine Arthur was always a bit inclined to sit on the fence.
Yes.
But yeah, it was a very, to me, this was a really important thing, not only for Churchill, but for Britain. And it's one of my major criticisms of him. If you were really interested in real British power, which, like it or not, depended on the empire, and particularly the old Commonwealth White Empire, and closer links between those countries, you had to support Imperial tariff reform. And just like with the Aliens Act of 1905, Churchill was against it. And as I said, the Aliens Act of 1905 was the first British attempt to regulate immigration into Britain.
Yeah, wasn't he oddly like in? Am I right in thinking that like in committee and things, he was just like railing against it, like saying like, "No way, this is terrible!" Like not just like voicing mild opposition.
Yeah,
but like doing everything he could to sort of scupper it.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, he crossed the floor.
For the immigration.
Oh, but he was still a backbencher when that happened, so his influence was much more limited back then.
But he was doing everything in his limited power.
Oh yeah, for sure. He when Churchill took a view on something, he totally went with that view and never changed his mind. You know. But yeah, to me, this coming out and crossing the floor to the Liberal Party, and this, of course, is why the Conservatives in the 1930s never trusted Winston Churchill. Many Conservatives never trusted Winston Churchill in the 1930s for precisely this reason. And bear in mind, Churchill himself said the only reason he joined the Conservative and Unionist Party, as opposed to the Liberals, was because he would never accept Irish Home Rule. Now, when he crosses the floor in 1908, the Home Rule is still the policy of the Liberal Party. So he held his nose for that one.
Yeah, it is kind of a scummy thing to do, to cross the floor. I've always thought that. If you don't like the party you're in, for whatever reason, there's some sort of ideological thing, line in the sand that you just can't keep going with them. Okay, leave. But like to cross the floor to another party is like changing sides in a war or something. I've just always thought it's
as we will see as we go forward on this stream, Churchill doesn't do that once; he does it twice.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So even if you think you might do it once, he does it twice for political expediency, as far as I can tell.
I have always thought it's odd. You know, it's like going and fighting as a mercenary for another country or something like that. Something of that order, to my mind.
Well, I might plead slightly guilty for that, but all right, fair enough. I think this is an important break for Churchill, and it's the first thing. I mean, I'm against when he was trying to talk against expanding the army during the Anglo-Boer War. Expanding the army was a very sensible thing to do during the Anglo-Boer War. I'm against his opposition to the Aliens Act because immigration control is a very important thing for a country, and by God, don't Britain know that these days. And then Imperial tariff reform for me is the final straw of, and this is 1908. This is well before the First World War. I had someone commenting on X on Twitter saying, "Oh, I was going to be doing another one of those streams, which was trying to rehabilitate Moustache Man in World War II, and say that the mid-century Germans were guys. Watch this stream. I'm not going to be doing that at all. That's not my position on Churchill." But
I've never accepted that, Iron Duke, that any criticism of Churchill is somehow an endorsement of the Nazis. Nonsense. Nonsense. I reject all of that wholesale. I just won't have it. No, I'm gonna have my opinion of Churchill. Thank you very much.
Yep, no, absolutely. I totally agree with you, Bo. And the point I'm trying to make is that, we're now at 1908. At this stage, I don't know what AH was doing, but he was somewhere in Austria being a kid. So, it's not important. Do we have anything else to say on Imperial tariff reform and Churchill ditching the Conservative Party and joining the Liberals, even though they still support Irish Home Rule, which Churchill had said was his main thing?
Yeah, I would just say something about the Liberals and Home Rule at this point. That obviously the Liberals had taken on Home Rule under Gladstone in the 1880s. By the time you get to 1905, 1906, they put it on the back burner. So they weren't so much committed to it. The reason they end up asking it...
Aaron, but you've also got to remember that people like Joseph Chamberlain had left the Liberal Party for precisely that reason, because they didn't support Irish Home Rule.
Oh, I absolutely agree with that. It's just that by the time you get to that 1905, 1906, you've got what are known as the Liberal Imperialists in power, and they have put the issue of Irish Home Rule on the back burner, and essentially, from their point of view, they have no interest in bringing about Irish Home Rule, mainly because it's a sort of divisive issue within their party at that point. It's like one of the descriptions of it at the time was, it was like they were a bull that had a nose ring being pulled out by the nose ring because of Irish Home Rule. And so when you've got people like Asquith and Campbell Bannerman and to a lesser extent Lord Rosebery, the former Prime Minister, and obviously Edward Grey, they are the Liberal Imperialists. They are, as I say, not particularly interested in Irish Home Rule at this point. They only become interested in it is the general elections of 1910, but I'm sure we'll get on to that point.
We've also, I think, got to mention briefly that because you brought up Edward Grey, Aaron, we have to mention briefly the ententes with first France and then Russia, which, of course, by crossing to the Liberal Party, Churchill was actually supporting.
Yes, and it really, I don't need to tell you this, Duke, but obviously that switch, particularly with the Russians, was a complete turnabout in British policy, going back to, well, pretty much the 1830s, essentially.
Well, it was basically Britain making friends with her two biggest traditional enemies, France and Russia, with the sole object of, well, I say the sole object, but with the obvious result that it was going to turn Germany into our enemy.
Yeah, and though I would say that a figure who wasn't a politician but was significant in that turnaround policy is obviously Sir Eyre Crowe, who's the senior mandarin in the Foreign Office. He's the one who writes the Crowe Memorandum in 1907, which is pretty much the basis for, well, it's one of the sort of integral basis for obviously Grey's foreign policy during the period of 1906 to I think he leaves Foreign Office in 1916, so, and particularly those sort of alliances with the Germans, with the French and the Russians, and so that they're so very much that's. I've got to say, I don't think Churchill was overly concerned about that, because he himself was obviously a Francophile. Unusual.
He was, yeah. His very first speech in Parliament criticised the Germans for bombarding Paris in the 1870 war.
One thing I would say, I think, is worth sort of noting or mentioning, perhaps, is sort of the general sort of anti-Germanness in the most general sense. It's hard to put your finger on, but I think I've heard Iron Duke talk about this before, and I think this is something it's very rarely highlighted enough. During and after World War II, the amount of anti-British sentiment there was in America It's everywhere. There's tons of it in the White House, in the intelligence services, in the top brass of the army, all over the place. Loads of it. We were sort of their enemy in all sorts of ways.
Because we were a possible enemy in the 1930s. Yeah,
absolutely.
Sure.
So the point I was going to make is just that in the turn of the late Victorian period and the turn of the 20th century, the amount of just general anti-German sentiment there was in Britain, in sort of what you might call the establishment.
I don't want to go too much down a rabbit hole here, but you've got to look at idiot things by the Kaiser, like the Kruger telegram. When he sent this stupid telegram at the time of the Jameson raid, which Aaron and I are actually going to do a stream about at some stage in the new year. But at the time of the Jameson raid, the Kaiser, who was not the brightest tool in the shed in many respects, sent a telegram to Kruger that was basically totally anti-British and kind of promising German help if they had to go to war with Britain, which of course, come 1899, he absolutely couldn't do because the German Navy wasn't strong enough to do it. Yeah.
So where I mentioned this sort of broad, all-pervasive feeling of sort of anti-Germanness, I'm not saying it was particularly warranted or something. I did a whole bit of content once with Godfrey Bloom talking about how sort of inexplicable it is, a lot of Edward Grey's foreign policy, and how Germany was in sort of naval terms a paper tiger, and how it was sort of some sort of maybe paranoia is a bit much, but Germany wasn't as much as a threat as perhaps many thought.
Well,
all I'm saying, wait.
We're going to get onto that, Bo. We're going to get onto that.
All I was going to say,
Churchill becomes First Lord of the Admiralty.
Sure.
So
all I was going to say
was,
oh sure, I'll just finish by saying that I'm just saying it was there. I'm not saying I necessarily agree with it. You can argue, I would argue for hours whether it was or not, but the fact that you can't deny is that it was there. People like Edward Grey or Churchill thought that way.
Oh, look, my view on all this is that Britain should have retained the policy of Lord Salisbury, which is Aaron's avatar there, of splendid isolation. Britain should have kept her options open. And, the idea that what you've got to realize is that by the time World War I comes around, the British Army had secret and largely illegal, it has to be said in British terms, staff talks with the French. And it was decided the British Army was going on the left of the French. It was already there. We'd already agreed with the French that they could withdraw their warships from the Channel and the North Sea and put them in the Mediterranean because the Royal Navy would protect them. And in my view, they were all false policies for Britain. Britain's policy should have been neutrality. We could have turned around and said to the Germans and the French in 1914, if either of you come out into the North Sea or the English Channel, we'll sink you. And the Germans and the French would both have stuck to that and wouldn't have come out because the Royal Navy was vastly more powerful than either of them. But we didn't. Instead of this, we committed ourselves pretty much to the French and the Russians.
Well, no, I absolutely think that the worst catastrophe of the 20th century was us not stopping ourselves from getting involved in World War II. World War One. World War One. That's why if I put anyone close to Churchill or second on the pedestal of having done the most damage to the British Empire, it would be Edward Grey.
Yep.
Simply for that he was sort of the main political mover in us more than
I don't disagree with that. I don't disagree with that at all.
If I could go back to one moment in time, like quantum leap back and change something, it would Britain getting involved in World War One.
Yeah, and being committed to it prior to the war. The thing is that the ententes with France and Russia had all the disadvantages of an alliance with none of the advantages, because it was not clear to Germany in 1914 that yes, Britain was basically going to join the war on the side of France and Russia. Had it been, then I suspect the Germans would have been much keener to stop the Austrians doing stuff in Serbia, etc., because Germany didn't want to fight Britain in World War One. I mean, I'm going to argue later on that Germany didn't really want to fight Britain in World War Two, but they certainly didn't in World War One. Aaron, you got anything to add to that stuff?
Oh no, I would just agree with Bo about the sort of general anti-German attitudes in Britain. You can very much see that in the popular fiction of the time, particularly William the Q, who writes a very famous book called in 1906 called The Invasion of 1910, which is essentially an German invasion of Britain, and that
was one of several books that were published roughly at the same time, postulating the same idea. Yeah, for sure, Aaron, you're right.
Yeah, and it's one of then that also contributes to the debate over conscription. In the front of the invasion of 1910, there's a piece that I'm not sure if I think it was written by Lord Roberts.
It was. Yes, it was. Yeah, he was president. President of some association which was trying to push for conscription. And for anyone who doesn't know, Lord Roberts was the successful British commander-in-chief in South Africa who took Bloemfontein and Johannesburg and Pretoria in 1900. But yeah, a good British commander, by the way.
Yeah.
But I don't think he was right about his conscription stuff myself. But yeah, look, we're going to come on to some of this because the only other thing I'm going to mention about Churchill while he was in the Liberals was that he became the Under Secretary of State for the Colonies, and he didn't do any favors to British South Africa. He was in favor of restricting British immigration to South Africa, which by this time was British run, of course, because the Boer War was over. So he was against that, and so he didn't let large numbers of British immigrants go to South Africa, which would have been the correct policy if you really wanted to turn South Africa into a bastion of the British Empire. And also, Natal ended up fighting a rebellion against the Zulus that was called the Bambata Rebellion, and Churchill really slagged off the Natal government, which was a British Natal government, because Natal had always been a British colony. And he really slagged them off and said that they were too nasty to the Zulus, which is pretty typical Churchill, really. Loads of lefties slag off Churchill, and I don't think they should, because Churchill was always a liberal as far as I'm concerned. You know, I think the liberal attacks on Churchill are vastly mistaken. But anyway,
funny point.
But I think we can now turn to World War One. And just before World War One, in 1911, Churchill is made First Lord of the Admiralty, and this is the political head of the Royal Navy. Obviously, the professional head is the First Sea Lord, but the political head is the First Lord of the Admiralty. And Churchill got this job and immediately wanted to micromanage everything, because that's the way Churchill did everything. This is a guy who we pointed out earlier, never commanded more than 40 blokes in the field. Right, I've commanded more than 40 blokes in the field, but Churchill never commanded more than that. And so there he was in charge of the largest navy in the world. And of course, we in 1911 are just at the end of the naval race with Germany. And as Bo correctly pointed out earlier, Britain by this stage had actually won the naval race. Britain had far more shipyards than Germany. And they were far more efficient. Like Britain could build easily 2 or 3 ships for every one that Germany could. And by, I think, 1911, 1912, about the time that Winston Churchill took over as political head of the Navy, Germany themselves, Tirpitz, the German admiral, had admitted No, we can't match Britain in building warships, and Britain has had a decisive edge in terms of dreadnoughts. You know, these are the powerful, fast, all big gun battleships, which basically made earlier battleships obsolescent. And we built the first one, HMS Dreadnought, in 1904, and she was built from keel laying to launch in under a year. That's how good the British shipyards were back then. These days, we take 5 years to build a bloody frigate, but back then, we could build a battleship in under a year. But yeah, so Churchill takes over, and actually from 1912, Anglo-German relations were actually improving. We were getting on better. Royal Navy ships were visiting German ports. German ships were visiting Royal Navy ports. And there was no great tension between Britain and Germany in 1912, 1913.
I mean, it's an interesting. I've always found the period from about 1910 up to the start of the war, like kind of a schizophrenic relationship, particularly the way the Germans deal with everyone else, but also Britain. There's sort of both things going on at once, right? You've got you've got hawkish parties and dovish parties, right? You've got the relationship between the Kaiser and the King. You know, they send letters to each other and are relatively kindly, and are cousins and things, and on some sort of diplomatic level, you could argue it's quite nice and stuff. But then also, exactly going on at exactly the same time, there's people talking about, and have been for years, talking about sort of, you know, the bigger strategic picture, whether it's a fair picture or not. You know, like, so for example, there was some after the Russo-Japanese War. There was all sorts of attempts with the Americans involved to sort of limit navies and have various ratios that different countries were allowed, right? All that sort of thing. So there's the power struggle has never gone away, right? The power struggle is always there, and on some level, sort of ramping up inexorably to the guns of August in 1914. But then, exactly as you say, Duke, there's this other thing, like quite a strong peace movement as well, like an explicit peace movement at the same time.
Yep.
So it's a schizophrenic thing, and you can find different quotes from the Kaiser from years before that are both very hawkish, like suicidally hawkish. And then just out and out plea for peace among humanity and things.
Well, the Kaiser wouldn't have been against an Anglo-German alliance. And in many respects, from Britain's point of view, Britain, of course, had the most powerful navy in the world. Germany had easily the most powerful army in the world. From Britain's perspective, in many respects, an Anglo-German alliance would have made a lot of sense. But we were already, as you'd pointed out earlier, because of Sir Edward Grey, we were already committed to the ententes with France and Russia, which basically meant that Britain was going to be a Franco-Russian ally in any big war. And so Britain and the British government had actually lost their freedom of maneuver.
Right, yeah. Unless they had an extremely, which they didn't, the only way out by summer 1914 was if they had some sort of crazily strong ultra peace party movement of a government to say, we don't really care what's gone on, we're just not getting involved in this conflict, and we didn't have that. So you're quite right. The die was already cast, right?
Yeah, and it has to be said that the Conservatives were more keen for a war with Germany than the Liberals were.
And Mr. Winston Churchill was extremely,
he was the most. He was
over the moon. Didn't he actually say
really
like this is great?
Didn't
he like actually say like this is brilliant when the war was declared? I can't. What an adventure this shall be and stuff.
Yeah, he really, 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 really wanted a war. He was one of the very few in the British cabinet, and I can't even say this of Sir Edward Grey, and I don't like Sir Edward Grey at all, but I can't say that he was keen on World War One, whereas Churchill absolutely was.
Like literally beaming with happiness. And
People
like,
said that about him. People thought he was somewhat inhuman,
yeah.
and they thought he was somewhat childish, and all sorts of other epithets were used about him, about how pleased he obviously was there was going to be this massive war that was going to kill millions of people.
Well, there's the old saying that, oh, well, they didn't know it was going to kill millions of people. Yeah, they could have a good guess, though.
Yeah, they could.
Ever since the American Civil War in the 1860s, it was like, no, when two industrial powers go at each other that can mass produce precision engineered artillery pieces or whatever, and endless ammo almost, yeah, it's going to be horrific. It's going to be absolutely horrific.
And half a dozen major powers with big industries, etc., and loads of people, it's going to be even worse. Yeah. And you know, Britain sent observers to the Russo-Japanese War, and we looked at the trenches and the barbed wire and all the rest of it, and the machine guns, and the enormously heavy casualties both the Russians and the Japanese took. It was not a total surprise to people. Trust me, it wasn't. But Churchill, mad keen for war. He mobilized the Royal Navy even before the British government decided to go to war. But yeah, so he was mad keen on this stuff, and then he did what he always did when he was a politician in a war. He did it repeatedly in World War II too. Started to try and micromanage what the admirals, because obviously he was in charge of the Admiralty, he was in charge of the Royal Navy. He started to try and micromanage what admirals on distant stations in the Mediterranean and in the Pacific and in the South Atlantic. He tried to micromanage what these people were doing, and of course, back then the only communications, I mean, there was radio, but it was in its infancy. So basically, you're sending telegraphs, and a politician who's never commanded more than 40 men, cavalrymen, in London, can't manage a British Royal Navy squadron in the South Pacific. That he can't.
It's an interesting point you made. I was reading something the other day about the Eastern Front, and they made the point that at one point, Stalin sort of stepped back after a while, realizing that he was no tactician. But to begin with, he was involved, and of course, Hitler increasingly was involved in sort of the minutiae of actual battlefield maneuvers and things. And so at one point it was said that the world's biggest land conflict is the Eastern Front, right? And that both sides were being commanded by complete amateurs, rank amateurs. And it's just that plays into what you're saying. The same with Churchill, playing around, LARPing as some sort of a grand lord of the Navy, when in fact...
This is taking us a bit forward, but in World War II, Stalin and Hitler kind of went the opposite way. Hitler took more charge of stuff, and Stalin took less, and and left it more to his generals. And
never had two bigger armies facing each other on an as big a front ever before or since in human history. And sitting at the top of each is this amateur playing around. But no, same goes for Churchill. I mean, same goes for Roosevelt as well. I mean, Roosevelt was no grand strategist, although he never pretended he was, at least. Is Aaron all right? Has he dropped out?
Yeah, he's just sending me a message. His internet has gone down, and I'm just saying, look, come back if you can. But if you can't, then you can't help it if his internet went down. But yeah. So I totally agree with you, Bo. It's I don't want to go too much detail because I could easily spend like a half an hour going on about the mistakes that Churchill made with the Royal Navy, but I will just briefly say the Royal Navy's first defeat since the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, in 1914, the Battle of Coronel, when two old British armored cruisers with a very brave admiral and very brave crews, but they were all reservists, like they'd been in the Royal Navy at one stage, but then they'd left and they worked in the merchant navy, or they were fishermen and, you know, trawler guys, this kind of stuff. And they got called up in World War One, and they got put on the Cape of Good, HMS Good Hope and HMS Monmouth, which were two old armored cruisers. And Churchill, through his various mistakes and trying to micromanage stuff, managed to get these two warships with a British light cruiser and a auxiliary cruiser, which was really kind of a merchant ship with a couple of guns stuck on it, fighting against the crack German East Asia squadron, which had two modern armored cruisers and four modern light cruisers, and which had repeatedly won the German Navy gunnery prizes and all the rest of it, because they'd been out in Tsingtao, which was the German base in China, under Admiral von Spee. And the British Admiral Craddock was a very brave man, but Churchill had already tried to, well, in fact, he did get a British Admiral court-martialed for not engaging the Gobden and the Breslau in the Mediterranean, two German warships. And the court-martial turned out all right for this admiral, but Craddock didn't want to be court-martialed, so he took his men into an action he damn well knew he couldn't win, and it resulted in the first British naval defeat in well over 100 years. And it was down to Winston Churchill. I'm sorry, it mostly was. So I'm just replying to Horace, Bo, so if you want to carry on, do so.
Yeah. I mean, he seemed to be extremely cavalier with other people's lives, right? And it's not to say that, as we've already said or hinted at, it's not that that's not how he treated himself. He was going into a cavalry charge, and doing all sorts of feats of bravery and being sort of oddly, or what might seem to us oddly, sang-froid about it, putting your life in absolute danger and thinking almost nothing of it. But doing that with other people's lives, though. I mean, I've seen people say, "Well, what did you want from him? Like, did you want him to be sort of this gaunt, haunted figure?" Well, not necessarily, but he didn't seem to care that much. He didn't seem to like make the right calculations. He didn't seem to weigh things up. I suppose if we get on to sort of the Dardanelles, or we could speak.
That's going to be the next thing I want to talk about. Yeah, but you are completely right. Churchill had no thought of these men he was sending into battle as human beings. I don't think he did. I think he regarded them as ants. You know, he didn't really. You know, if you're a good commander, you obviously you realize that, you know, if you're going to make war, you got to break eggs. That's going to happen. You're going to get casualties, right? I've had casualties under my command, and you never like it, but it's a fact of life. It's going to happen. But Churchill just didn't seem to give a shit, basically. like two whole warships with like 900 blokes on each one. And anyone with any common sense could see Craddock was not going to win that fight. And there was a modern British armored cruiser. I think it was HMS Defence, but I may be wrong. There was actually more powerful than von Spee's ships, and that had a regular crew that could have gone down there, but Churchill sent it somewhere else. Craddock had a very old pre-Dreadnought battleship, and as luck would have it, the engineering officer on this ship was losing his mind, tried to say, oh, we can only make 14 knots, when in fact it could easily do 17 knots, but the guy was losing his brain. And if Craddock had kept that ship with him, HMS Canopus, it's very likely that Von Spee would have just not engaged, because it had 12-inch guns, which he had no defense against. But yeah, then we come, of course, to the infamous Gallipoli campaign, mainly driven by Churchill. And the thinking behind it, for people in the chat and listening to this, is that if you could force the Dardanelles, you could then send supplies, etc., to the Russians. That was the whole point of it. But it was originally supposed to be a naval operation, purely a naval operation. And that didn't work because the Turks had laid some minefields, etc. And too many warships were getting hit by these mines. And so then, instead of saying, okay, that didn't work, let's do something else, Churchill said, oh, no, we'll send a bloody great army out there, you know? We'll use the Australian division and the New Zealand division and the very last regular British division, the 29th division, which had been collected from all parts of the empire. These were the last regular soldiers Britain had left, because Britain had a fairly small army in 1914, although it was 3 times the size it is today, by the way, guys. Our contemptible little army in 1914 was 3 times bigger than it is today. So, you know, but anyway, and that's without the Indian army and all the rest of it, by the way. But anyway, yeah. So he launches this massive campaign. The Australian and New Zealand troops were very brave. They were very good, fit, physical dudes. But they weren't very well trained because they hadn't been in the military very long, which is what people forget. And the other thing worth mentioning is the Japanese, who had been British allies since 1902, Japanese warships escorted the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, the Anzacs, to the Middle East because they were our allies at the time.
I've looked at the Dardanelles, the Gallipoli campaign, in a fair bit of detail a couple of times, and I'm absolutely fascinated by, pardon me, the war in the East in World War One, and I mean the Middle East, not the Russian front. Although I am fascinated by that, I'm absolutely fascinated by the story of T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, and how we went up from Cairo in the end with the Arabs all the way up to Damascus and in the end on to Constantinople. And so the Gallipoli thing seems to me, I'm speaking as broadly as it's possible to speak, it was just a harebrained, scatterbrained thing from its very first concept, which I believe came from Churchill. Just the idea that we're just going to sail straight up to Constantinople and just blow it away and blockade it. And we're just going to do that. We're just going to cut straight to the chase.
Well, I mean, the other thing, Bo, is that the main driver of World War One was the German army, right? Even if you knock out Turkey, Turkey was the weakest of the Central Powers. It's not going to have a bad effect on Germany, really. It's going to free up some British and French troops. Yes, it would. It's going to free up some Russian troops, but it's not going to really affect things on the Western Front, which was the main front where most of the German army was.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's very, very interesting, isn't it? All those arguments about how the other fronts affect the Western Front through Belgium and Northern France. Yeah.
Churchill liked these soft underbellies, as we'll come to when we get to World War II.
Of course, I know you know this. I'm not suggesting you don't know this, but of course it was the Ottoman Empire, wasn't it? It wasn't Turkey.
Yeah.
So we're dealing with the Ottoman Empire, which stretched all the way down to Mecca and Medina, and was knocking on the door of Egypt, right? So there's more going on. Obviously, again, I know you know this, but I'm just saying it. There's so much more going on in World War One
Well,
than the Western Front. Right?
Bo, look at the siege of Kut, and Townsend, the British commander there, with his British and Indian troops. He was eventually surrounded and forced to surrender. And because the troops were not treated very well by the Turks, loads and loads of guys died in Turkish captivity. If it had not been for the Gallipoli campaign, the Australian and New Zealand troops and the British 29th Division could have been sent there, and there would have been no surrender at Kut. So, you know.
Well, I mean, that story of Faisal and the Arabs, with the help of C.E. Lawrence, you know, going to Aqaba, taking Aqaba, and then fighting all the way up to Damascus and on, rolling the Ottomans up essentially, and you know, in the end, they implode, don't they? Well, I say implode. You get Mustafa Kemal and you get Ataturk, but the Ottoman Empire is over with.
And then, well, there's also the successful British and Commonwealth actions against the Turks in Palestine, etc. Which, like,
well, yeah, I mean, it's all part of the same thing. Allenby is Lawrence's left flank, or rather, Lawrence is Allenby's right flank.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And you know, you get things like the one of the last great cavalry charges in history, the Australian light horse at Beersheba and stuff like that. You know,
well,
successful cavalry charges, by the way.
It's how we end up controlling Jerusalem, right? That we wouldn't be in Jerusalem if it wasn't for all those campaigns.
Yes.
So, well, it's Allenby that enters Jerusalem, isn't it? So
yes, it is. Yeah.
But for me, going back to Churchill and the Dardanelles, it seems to me, when you look at it in a bit of detail, we just haven't got time here, but like the ships that were sort of cobbled together, there was a lot of sort of older, and
yes,
even you might say sort of defunct stuff that the Royal Navy.
There was a lot of obsolescent pre-dreadnoughts from the Royal Navy and the French Navy. Yes, there were.
As soon as you look at it in any detail, it's like, this is dumb. This is a bad idea.
From the army point of view, the troops never had enough room to deploy properly because the positions were too shallow. And you know, it's totally forgotten these days, of course. But in Australia, you know, we have Anzac Day every year, but which commemorates the initial landings of the Anzac. But it's always forgotten that 2.5 times more British troops died at Gallipoli than Australians and New Zealanders, because we had a lot more men there and we lost a lot more men. But it's almost totally forgotten in Britain today.
I mean, Horace makes a good point in the chat just now. He's just said that there was this sort of fear of Germany. Again, very, very general sweep of the brush here, but Germany pushing into the Black Sea region or even beyond. This idea that in World War II, Churchill wanted to try and push down into the Caucasus, maybe even down as far as Iran. And it all sounds like pie in the sky nonsense. It sounds like complete paranoid craziness. But no, there were Krupp guns and German regulars in the deserts of Arabia.
Yeah, but not many.
Not many.
No.
Well, yeah, no, not many, but
yeah, it would have been. There were some. There were certainly German commanders and stuff who were giving advice to the Turks. As you say, there was some German artillery, etc.
All the air power was German.
Yeah, and the Breslau and Gobden were supposedly handed over to the Turks, although in fact they kept their German groups. The officers just started wearing fezzes instead of their German caps. But that was containable. All of that was containable. And Gallipoli was a disaster, and Churchill was sacked as a result because there was an inquiry which he spent some weeks giving evidence to, and he was subsequently sacked from the government. He then supposedly became a battalion commander on the Western Front. Now, where he famously, for reasons best known to himself, always wore a French helmet rather than a British one, which many people thought was ridiculous, but he did.
Like wearing an RAF uniform in the rubble of the Blitz.
Yeah.
Why are you wearing that? Why you're not in the RA? You're not an RA. What?
Oh, look, we could have talked about Antwerp, where Churchill got a couple of Royal Naval brigades, including a load of Royal Marines, into a lot of trouble. We could have talked about that. But if you're going to go into you could do a whole stream on just Churchill in the First World War if you wanted to.
Yeah.
But given we're trying to cover
Sure.
1945, we have to move on a bit. But anyway, Churchill supposedly became a battalion commander on the Western Front. He didn't, in fact, do that job because he'd never commanded more than 40 men in battle. He didn't know how to be a battalion commander. His battalion adjutant actually ran the battalion, and Churchill just hung around, basically. He wasn't cowardly. He was not cowardly. That's not what I'm suggesting. But he didn't know how to do a battalion commander's job, and he, in fact, didn't do that job. His battalion adjutant did.
Was he like a colonel?
Well, he would have supposedly been a lieutenant colonel, but but given he'd never commanded more than 40 men as a lieutenant in the cavalry, he wasn't qualified to command like 900 guys in an infantry battalion at all. And
did he go on trench raids? Did he actually?
I don't know if he did or not. He served in the trenches. He wasn't cowardly, as I say. I'm not going to accuse Churchill of being personally cowardly. He wasn't. But he was not an effective battalion commander, and he just left it to his battalion adjutant. Aaron, you just come back. Did you have anything you wanted to say about Gallipoli and the stuff we've been talking about?
Just to agree that it was a harebrained scheme, but I would also add that it wasn't the only harebrained scheme going around the Admiralty at the time. Mm-hmm. You had that scheme, the proposed landings in the Baltic.
I think that was much less harebrained, actually, but that was that was actually planned by an actual naval officer and not by Winston Churchill.
Yes, Jackie Fisher, who, a very illustrious naval officer with a long career. But I would also like to point out, Duke, that Jackie Fisher, like Churchill, was very much pro-war. He was, before the First World War, advocating for the Copenhagen.
Yeah, but you see, Aaron, that makes some sense, though, because what Jackie Fisher argued is if we're going to fight Germany, let's surprise them in port and sink them in port, which makes some sense.
Yeah, no,
I mean, that's a military officer's plan, you know. If you can surprise the enemy, that's what you do.
Yeah, no, the reason I mention is that I think when Churchill's at the Admiralty before the First World War, you've got a combination there in terms of his pro-war attitude of what we previously referred to as that boy's own adventure mentality, combined with taking on the pro-war attitudes of the senior naval officers like Jackie Fisher. And so
the other thing, you've also got to remember that Fisher was getting on a bit by the time he was made First Lord of the Admiralty again. They had got rid of Louis Battenberg purely because he had some German relations.
Yeah.
And there was no evidence whatsoever that Battenberg was in the least pro-German. But they got rid of him nonetheless because he had some German relations. And replaced him with Jackie Fisher. And Jackie Fisher was already really officially retired. So, you know.
Yeah. But
yeah, true enough. He comes back into the government in 1918, I think, as armaments minister, I believe. That's how he comes back into the Liberal government. So he ends the war back in the government again, but under something of a cloud, because Gallipoli was an enormous disaster. It achieved nothing whatsoever and cost so many casualties, and also a lot of sunk warships as well. Complete disaster from the Allies' point of view, and a complete waste of time. Loads of troops even died of disease as a result.
How you could show your face for shame after that. Let alone
Churchill always tried to
let alone
defend
try and
himself.
brush it under the carpet, you know.
Yeah, Churchill always tried to defend himself about it. He always did.
Mm.
You know, fortunately, Kitchener sent a guy out there to go and look at the stuff, and Kitchener himself went eventually and just said, look, this is going nowhere. We've got these little tiny beachheads which are completely packed with our supplies and rear echelon troops and all the rest of it. And the Turks have got all the high ground and can just shell us anytime they want to. And whenever we attack, we've got to go up steep hills and rocks and all the rest of it. And the Turkish machine guns and snipers can just destroy us. And it was a complete disaster. And it achieved absolutely nothing except get a lot of good British, Australian, and New Zealand, and also French soldiers killed for no purpose, and sailors as well.
I will just say that why Churchill may not have felt any shame is because this was a government led by David Lloyd George, a man who I think had shame is capacity to feel shame removed at birth.
Yeah, for sure.
You just think about the way that he treated Gough, the commander of the Fifth Army, during the Spring Offensive, where Gough was treated as a scapegoat by Lloyd George for Lloyd George's failures there. And also, you've got sort of Lloyd George lying brazenly during the Maurice debate, where he's accused of lying. He lies and he gets away with it. So, I think there was a general sense of shamelessness in the government at that time. So Churchill returning after the disaster of Gallipoli sort of makes more sense.
Yeah, there's one other thing I wanted to talk about that I didn't, but it's only going to be a 2-minute aside. When Churchill was Home Secretary in the early 1910s, before he became First Lord of the Army, he was involved in the Sydney Street siege, where some anarchists were causing problems. You know, they were basically terrorists of the era, mostly Jewish, it has to be said, and you know, planting bombs and all this kind of stuff. And Winston Churchill, as Home Secretary, was down there with the police and the army, you know, because he was Winston Churchill, you know. That's not the Home Secretary's job, you know. And many senior politicians actually laughed at him about this because they, you know, that's not the Home Secretary's job. He's not supposed to be a subaltern, you know.
Yeah, there's a famous, or maybe not famous, but there's a photograph of him there, sort of pointing up at a window and smiling and talking to someone, and he's obviously in his element where there's a bit of danger. He's one again, a late Victorian adventure hound, right? He loves where there's going to be some gunplay, that he wants to be there, that type of person. It's just not the person you want to become Prime Minister during 1940.
Absolutely.
That's
or First Lord of the Admiralty in the First World War.
Right.
But it's kind of not. That is just so true. So anyway, we're going to move on to the interwar period.
Mm-hmm.
And in the interwar period, the first part of it, Churchill had quite a few senior jobs. He was War Minister and Air Minister in 1919. And it was Winston Churchill, much more than any other single person, who was responsible for what later became the infamous 10-year rule. The idea that Britain would not be involved in a major war for at least 10 years. And what happened with the 10-year rule, as I know that Bo and Aaron both know, but for the benefit of people who are listening to this, was that it got extended every year. So, you know, in 1919, the 10-year rule was not such a terrible idea because it was merely saying Britain probably wouldn't be in a major war until 1929. The trouble is, they extend it in 1920, in 21, in 22, in 23, in 24, 25. They just keep extending it. So it never changes, which obviously is ridiculous. So the British Armed Forces remained very weak for all that period. And the guy most responsible for writing the 10-year rule was Winston Churchill. Just fact.
Yeah, and again, we can only really use broad strokes with the brush again. But the 20s, the mid to late 20s and the early 30s were an extremely tumultuous time for Britain. Well, for nearly everyone, for nearly the whole world, but for Britain particularly. The Great Strike and then the Great Depression and all sorts of stuff. When you look at some of, I know George Orwell is a lefty, but you look at some of George, like Road to Wigan Pier or something.
Mm-hmm.
It was, it was a time, a really tough time of austerity, and the golden age, if you like, of the mid to late Victorian period. We're much more in a period of what you might call stagnation or something. Not sure.
Well, Britain went into World War One in August 1914 as still probably the most powerful nation on earth. She wasn't by the end of 1918. By the time of the armistice in November 1918, Britain was a debtor nation, particularly to America. Now, all right, we were owed money by various European nations, including France, which we never got either, by the way. But we were a major debtor to America at that stage, which in 1914 was not true. Everyone owed Britain money in 1914.
Absolutely. I've heard it characterized as that the wealth of an empire was transferred from London to New York.
Pretty much.
By World War One.
Yeah, pretty much.
So yeah, the 20s and 30s wasn't a whole lot of fun.
You've got to come on to another major thing from my point of view is the 1922 Washington Naval Conference, where Britain handed over command of the world's oceans. British politicians handed over command of the world's oceans purely because they didn't want to get in a naval race with America. And lest anyone thinks it had anything to do with the Navy, it didn't. The Royal Navy had plans to build the four most powerful battleships and the four most powerful, very heavily armored battle cruisers in the world, the G3s and the N3s, and say to the Americans, well, if you think you can build something like that, go for it. But you have to bear in mind that the extremely efficient and very many British shipyards in 1919 could still outbuild the Americans. They could. Unless the Americans wanted to spend an absolute fortune on building new dockyards, etc., which the American Congress were never going to agree to.
When you look at US industrial output before World War One, it's remarkably low. I mean, we're just all used to America being the behemoth, right? Being the titanic, colossal producer, and certainly before World War One, it just wasn't. It wasn't the case.
Not in terms of shipbuilding. In terms of shipbuilding, Britain could outbuild Germany and America combined if we wanted to.
In terms of many things.
But I mean, Germany and America were probably producing more steel than Britain by 1914. In fact, I'm quite sure they were. But we still had more shipyards and more efficient shipyards. We could still turn out warships. Like I said, Britain could have outbuilt Germany and America in 1914. And I've occasionally heard people saying, oh, Britain had to get into the First World War because Germany might have taken over Belgium and France and all the rest of it. Well, the French shipyards were crap, frankly. They really were. They were not efficient at all. And they were also relatively small. They would have needed a lot of money spending on them to make them bigger. And Belgium, for example, had no shipyards in 1914. Not one. Not that could build a warship. So again, this is nonsense we sometimes hear. But Britain had nothing to fear from, and that's assuming, of course, that Wilhelmine Imperial Germany was actually going to permanently occupy France and Belgium, which I think would have been extremely unlikely, even if they could have afforded it. You know,
Yeah.
much more likely that if Germany had won, if Britain hadn't joined World War One, I think there's a good chance that Germany would have won in 1915, certainly in 1916. And I think the results would have probably been much more similar to 1870 than anything else. I think Germany might have taken a few French colonies. They might have taken a few slivers of French land. They weren't going to occupy the place forever.
I would have liked 1914 to have ended as 1870 did. The German High Command get to Versailles and impose a humiliating treaty on France, and the French government falls, and maybe Germany take a tiny bit of the Saar or Rhineland or something like that, and that's it. And that's it. There's no need for millions and millions and millions of men to have died over that.
John Best makes a good point that I forgot. Of course, in the time of the Washington Naval Conference in 1922, Britain was allied with Japan, and one of the American demands was that Britain give up that alliance, which of course mortally offended the Japanese, which came back to haunt Britain in 1941, 1942, I should say. But late 1941. It came back to haunt Britain, with Singapore and all the rest of it. But yeah, and Japan,
all their shit
for 20 years was a completely steadfast ally of the British.
Their Imperial fleet was basically copied from us in all sorts of ways.
We even built some of it. We even built some of it, Bo. If you go to Japan today, and if you ever want to see a British-built battleship, you have to go to Japan. Go and see the Mikasa in Japan, which was the flagship of Admiral Togo at the Battle of the Tsushima Strait against the Russians in 1904, and she was built in Britain.
And just the structure of their navy and all sorts of things. They just in the 19th century they looked at the British and said they're the best at this. We're going to copy them. But it's interesting actually during the war, World War II. I mean, the war in the Pacific. It's interesting that obviously America is fighting Japan, obviously, but they're looking to undermine Britain at every possible opportunity. And the French and the Dutch.
Yeah,
America was looking to dominate the whole Pacific Rim against everyone.
Yeah, but you're absolutely right, and we're going to get onto that when we get to World War II in a minute. Sorry. But Tomb of Arminius says that we traded Japan for the US. We actually didn't, because the Americans wouldn't give the British an alliance. So we got rid of an actual alliance for nothing, basically.
Yeah. We're already in their pocket. We're already doing what the Treasury Department wants.
And this is not difficult to do. Google is your friend, or whatever search engine you use. If you want to look at the size of the Royal Navy in 1919 compared to the size of the American Navy in 1919, the Royal Navy is enormously bigger. So what the 1922 Washington Naval Treaty does is it makes Britain scrap half its fleet, pretty much. So we both end up with 15 battleships. So all it did was the command of the world's oceans, which was given to Britain by Admiral Nelson and the officers and men of the Royal Navy at Trafalgar, etc., is given away in 1922 by British politicians, including Winston Churchill, who said not a single word against it, and I think supported it. But then, of course, Winston Churchill was half American, and to my mind, he often favoured the American side of his family over the British one. But Aaron, you haven't said much, mate. What's your thinking about this stuff?
But I'm going to slightly push back on you, Duke, about the 10-year rule and Churchill's role, because
he designed it. He did.
No, I entirely agree. It was a bad policy, but I think you've got to remember it was in the context of that era of the post-war Lloyd George coalition, where there was a call, both within the government and outside of it, for retrenchment, economically speaking. You have Eric Geddes, who's a businessman, who's brought in by Lloyd George to look across.
The Geddes Acts.
Yeah, Geddes Acts, yes. And so Churchill is writing that in a government where that is regarded as the right thing to do. So whilst Churchill deserves the blame for implementing it and for writing it, if the government, particularly Lloyd George, had not been in favour of that retrenchment.
Bear in mind, though, Aaron, this is a Liberal government, which is not a pro-British government. You know, the Liberals were the left-wingers of their day before they were replaced by Labour. So they were not in favour of a strong Britain. Whereas Churchill, we are told today, was this massive, conservative, greatest prime minister ever. No. That's the only point I would make about that.
Yeah, and also with the 10-year rule, I just want to bring up something else, which is this, one of the reasons why it was continually pushed back was because of the debt. And if you're going to blame somebody for that, that is Stanley Baldwin's fault, because he is sent by Andrew Bonar Law over to the United States to negotiate the debt payments for Britain, and he completely balls it up to the degree that when Baldwin comes back in, I think it's March 1923, and he informs Bonar Law of what he's done. Bonar Law is almost going to resign out of protest of what Baldwin's done, and that puts shackles on Baldwin's negotiation, puts shackles on British defence spending from that point onwards until pretty much the outbreak of the Second World War. So the 10-year rule was a bad policy, and Churchill deserves blame for his involvement in it. But there were various other contributing factors to its extension, and the general feeling of the era played into it. And if you hadn't had that sense of there's a need for government retrenchment, the Geddes Acts, and Lloyd George's support for it, that 10-year rule would not have been brought in the first place, even if Churchill wanted it.
Sorry, guys, I was watering the flowers, as they say. This is the thing that I don't get, is that this Winston Churchill is supposedly this great conservative, and he wasn't a conservative, all right? We're almost getting to the stage where he crosses the floor for a second time from the Liberals back to the Conservatives again, right? This is a man who had no principles, if you ask me. You know, as Bo said earlier, I think you can do that once, okay? I do. You know, there are one or two Conservatives who are leaving the Conservative Party and joining Reform, yeah? I think you can do that once if your party is taking the wrong turn. But to do it twice shows that you'll do anything for expediency. That's my view. I don't know what Bo and Aaron think about that.
Yeah, the person that springs to mind is Pompey Magnus, Pompey the Great. He changed sides, so to speak. I mean, political factions and parties were very, very different in the ancient world, but nonetheless, he changed sides like well over 10 times during his career.
He started off supporting Sulla, didn't he? And then he was a big mate of Caesar, and then not a mate.
He tried to be in Maris's faction before Sulla even, but he was rebuffed there and then went to Sulla. Anyway, the point is, yeah, there's some people that have sort of, say what you like about somebody like Stalin or Mao. At least they had their principles, as effed up as those principles are and insane as they ended up being. Right? At least they're not just blowing with the wind. And it seems like Churchill. I mean, one good example of this is how Churchill seemed to me, a genuine staunch anti-Bolshevik.
Until he wasn't.
Until he wasn't. Until the day he wasn't. And then after the war, almost immediately again, suddenly this like sort of staunch, there's an Iron Curtain that somehow magically descended across Europe. I don't know about what that's about. But
had nothing to
you know, like,
nothing to do with us supporting the Soviet Union.
an Iron Curtain, which I agreed to at Yalta, has unfortunately descended across Europe. No, so yeah, like the way you could, that's a good example, where you're crossing the floor, or the way you could be a massive anti-communist, then literally be the ally of Joe Stalin, then be a massive anti-Stalinist again, right? It does speak of a type of politics, a type of person, a type of character to do that. It's not sort of, I don't know. I don't like it. I don't like it.
I have heard people say that Churchill brought in some of the early social services like old age pensions and stuff like that, and that there is some truth in that. But in the 1926 general strike, and I think we can talk about this now because we're getting into that era, Churchill said, "Give me a whip and I'll whip them back to work." And this was the same blokes who had just fought World War I and won it at an enormous cost, like 1 million British and Commonwealth casualties. Dead. I'm sorry, 1 million British and Commonwealth dead. And Churchill saying to these same men, "Oh, give me a whip and I'll whip them back to work." And I know that because my grandfather, who was born in 1908, told my dad that, who was born in 1933.
Yeah, a lot of Welshmen, Southern Welshmen anyway, had a particular hating for Churchill. The way
miners for sure. Yeah,
the way he sort of dealt with and broke up a lot of their
Tony Pandy riots, I think it was, wasn't it?
Yeah. A lot of people blame him for that.
And actually, that on the Tony Pandy and the Fulani strikes in 1910 and 1911, what people say about Churchill, and this is one of the few times you'll hear me defend him on here, Churchill actually didn't. A lot of what people claim Churchill did, he didn't do. For example, at Tony Pandy and at Fulani, the reason why the troops were sent there, Churchill approved the troops being sent there as Home Secretary, but it was at the request of the local chief constables. And at Tony Pandy, the troops did not open fire. In fact,
they refused. The officers and men wouldn't be nasty to the miners, which I thought was really good for the British Army. They refused.
And I should point out that both at Tony Pandy and at Flannelly, the army officers had autonomy in what they wanted to do. So this wasn't either they weren't taking orders from either the chief constable necessarily or the Home Office with Churchill. And the only person at Tony Pandy to die was a single miner who was killed more than likely by a policeman. And at Tony Pandy, the majority of the people sent there weren't soldiers; they were officers of the Metropolitan Police. And in Tony Pandy, the army, the troops there, had a better reputation during that strike.
They did.
The police did. Now,
I've always been happy with the British Army there because the officers and men refused to get nasty with the miners. They wouldn't use bayonets or bullets.
Yeah. I will say that there was shooting at Flannelly. However, in that situation, the strikers were being extremely violent and they had pushed the soldiers of the Worcestershire Regiment, commanded under a man called Major Stewart, into a cutting, and they were really threatening them, and so that's why they opened fire. And as far as I'm concerned, Major Stewart and his men were in the right. And I think 2 men died there because of that. And then the following day, one of the miners who was on strike effectively killed himself because he tried to dynamite a armoured wagon on a train, which, though he didn't know this, was full of munitions. And so he blew that up and blew himself up. However, the point I'm making here is that a lot of the idea of Churchill suppressing these poor miners with troops is a socialist myth. Churchill.
Hang on. I'm not saying he did it with troops but the reason he didn't do it with troops is that the British Army officers and men wouldn't do what he wanted. But Churchill was extremely raucous, as he always was. He was very bellicose.
Can I add a little substance? Yeah, okay, so there wasn't a massacre or anything. I would never claim there was because there wasn't. The point is that in the minds of whether it's warranted or not, in the minds of a lot of Welsh people, he was bellicose against them. He sent the army. Yeah, the army didn't massacre them, but he sent the army.
But the army didn't massacre them because the army decided not to do it. It wasn't Churchill,
and they resented it. Whether it's fair or not, that was their perception.
Sorry, this needs. I feel I need to say this. If we're rightly criticising Churchill on this stream for things he did. When it comes to Tony Pandy and Flannelly, he approved the use of troops at the request of the local chief constables,
sure.
Which was not unusual and was used before by.
Aaron, are you saying that Churchill did not say, "Give me a whip and I'll whip him back to work"? Because he did.
No, I'm not saying that. No. We're talking about pre-war with Flannelly and Tony Pandy.
Oh, okay. No, I'm now talking about like the 1920s. All right.
Oh, with the general strike, yeah, he did. But I would also point out that was not an uncommon opinion in the Baldwin government at the time. Churchill might have been the most vocal in expressing it.
Yeah,
but
because he always was. If he could get in a fight, Churchill wanted to get in a fight, especially if he was going to get other people killed. That's my problem with Churchill. He was. I mean, in that instance, I would have actually supported him going to the front and being in the front where he could have got punched by the miners. But I just think Churchill was mad keen always to get into conflicts. He liked it. And I think most of us have agreed with this. Like all through this stream, this is one thread that goes through Churchill's life. He was always mad keen to get into a conflict, whether it was like the Sydney Street Siege or World War I or World War II. Churchill just said, "Yeah, let's go do it," like some child, That's my point. That's the point I'm trying to make here, Aaron, is that Churchill was always mad keen on doing that shit, He was never somebody who would say, "Hang on, let's these are British guys. There's a load of unemployment. There are people who can't feed their families. Maybe we don't need to escalate this more than we have to,
Yes, but
they're the same guys who just won World War One, that sort of thing,
Oh no, I agree. Churchill was willing to escalate it and wanted to, but so did Stanley Baldwin. Stanley Baldwin's the man who gives him control of the propaganda newspaper, the British Gazette. This is the point I'm making. Yeah, Churchill is rightly criticised for that, and you should criticise him for that. But again, he is working in a government that agreed with him. Baldwin is supporting this. The idea this is somehow unique to Churchill in that government is just inaccurate.
All right, fair enough. Briefly, and I'm no expert on this, all right, I'm mostly a naval and military historian, right? I don't pretend. I'm mainly a British naval and military historian. That stuff I can talk to anyone about, but I am not an economist. So Churchill, as Chancellor of the Exchequer, takes Britain back onto the gold standard, and I think we have to talk about this a little bit. But like I say, it's not my area of expertise. So if Bo or Aaron know more about this, go for it, guys.
Go on, Aaron, if you know it.
Churchill does take Britain onto the gold standard. It's a mistake. British is a mistake. This is an example of Churchill taking on the opinions of his department. The Treasury is in favour of returning to the gold standard, but economists outside the Treasury are criticising. For example, John Maynard Keynes makes an impassioned argument at the time for Britain not to return to the gold standard.
I'm no fan of Keynes, I've got to say, but okay.
I'm not a particular fan of his either, especially his what I regard as pro-German attitudes over the Versailles Treaty. But in this case, he's correct, and it does damage the British economy. And it does lead to, though the British economy isn't as hard hit as everybody else, as the rest of the world, by the Great Depression. One of the reasons why it's a bit more intensified for Britain, in it, relatively speaking, is because we were on the gold standard and we had to come off. However, when we came off the gold standard, our economy started to recover, and that's why in the 30s we have high regional unemployment, but the national unemployment is relatively low. And
I
by
think,
the mid-30s, you have an economic boom going on.
Aram, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the things I've read is that it wasn't so much Britain going on the gold standard that was bad. It was the rate that Churchill put us on the gold standard. Like, you could have done it at a lower rate than he did.
Yes, but again, I do think that again is a part of Churchill taking on the opinions of his department. That is what the Treasury was telling him to do, and so he took it on. But that was the way Churchill did it and the way the Treasury wanted it done, a damage to the British economy at the time.
Just about this stage, probably a bit earlier than this, actually, Churchill crosses the floor again from the Liberals back to the Conservatives, basically because David Lloyd George, who was probably the least principled British Prime Minister ever, I would guess, unless Starmer has beaten him, which maybe he has. But I'd say David Lloyd George, one of the people I dislike most in British political history. He was no longer leader of the Liberals, and I think that was when Churchill went back to the Conservatives. Am I right? I think so.
Yes, when the coalition government falls, he loses his seat in the November 1922 general election. For about 2 years, he's looking for another seat, and then he gets re-elected in, I think it's the second election. It's the autumn election in 1924, where he's elected as a constitutionalist, and then he rejoins the Conservative Party, I think, in early 25.
And then he falls out with them, because the Conservative Party at this stage did what they should have full-on supported in 1907, 1908, and supports Imperial tariff preference when it's too late, because World War I's happened. Imperial tariff preference in between 1906 and 1908 would have made the British position extremely strong. But when you owe loads of money to America and your markets have been so thoroughly penetrated in the 1920s by the Americans and the Germans and the French and the Russians and everybody else, it makes much less sense, and they also don't do it strongly enough. And as a result, even though Churchill has gone back to the Conservatives, because he's just a free trader and he won't even look at anything that's not free trade, he falls out with the Conservative leadership again. Would that be a fair way to characterize it, guys?
Go ahead, Aaron.
Yeah, and also a bit later, after they lose office in 29, the fact that Baldwin comes over to supporting the Irwin Commission proposal, I think it is, over Indian self-government. The combination of tariff reform and Indian government reform does it. I would like to point out a slight irony over the tariff reform issue. Churchill, obviously being a big free trader, is opposed to tariff reforms. His great friend Max Aikins, Lord Beaverbrook, owner of the Daily Express, is at the same time campaigning with Lord Rothermere, the owner of the Daily Mail, to remove Baldwin as leader, because Baldwin isn't going far enough on the issue of tariff reform. And there's actually a very strange plot in, I think, early 1931, where Churchill conspires with Beaverbrook, Rothermere, and Neville Chamberlain, who was then head of the Tory research department, to try and remove Baldwin from office to stick Chamberlain in. It doesn't succeed because there's a by-election at Westminster St George's where Baldwin was going to stand, but he was convinced not to, and then the Tory candidate wins there. But it's strange irony where you've got Churchill, who is, my apologies, sort of out of step with the Tory party leadership over tariff reform, willing to ally with tariff reforms to remove Baldwin from office as Tory leader.
Yeah, absolutely correct. And incidentally, I think Churchill was probably right about Indian independence. On the other hand, I'm not going to argue with Churchill about India wasn't ready for independence, because I don't think it was. But in terms of tariff reform, he was totally wrong. And this was the major reason why he had those so-called wilderness years that people talk about. When he was supposedly warning about the rise of Adolf Hitler, and the conservatives were ignoring him, and Churchill was getting secret information from very rich, almost entirely Jewish groups, it has to be said. I mean, the Focus, I think it was called, was the group. I know Horace in the chat will tell me if I'm wrong. But yeah, the Focus was a Jewish-inspired group, and they were giving Churchill information he shouldn't have had, some of which was stolen from British intelligence sources, etc.
Yes, one of the people who is, of course, providing Churchill with intelligence at this point is Desmond Morton, who had been an MI5 officer in the 20s. I think he had retired at that point, or no, I think he'd been moved over to another department, and he is obviously supplying Churchill with information. I would say, though, that I think people are both who are admirers of Churchill's and opponents of Churchill do sometimes exaggerate Churchill's influence in the 30s in his wilderness years. He is obviously off the airways of the BBC because Lord Reith hates him, and Reith is himself a supporter of appeasement, and a lot of the press won't give Churchill any time of the day. Even Beaverbrook, who's his great friend, because obviously Beaverbrook and a lot of the press, particularly the Times under, I forgot the name, Geoffrey something or other, is very much taking the line of the Baldwin and Chamberlain government, and Brands, MacDonald, Baldwin and Chamberlain governments. And
yeah, I do totally agree with you, Aaron. Bo, I've just seen your message in the chat, and yeah, we can do a part 2 on this, which will be World War II, basically.
Yeah, that'd be great, because I've got to go relatively soon, guys. But there's so much more. In fact, all the best stuff is still to talk about.
Yeah, exactly. World War II.
One point I would want to make about those, again, a broad point about the. Particularly the interwar years, or when he is in his own political wilderness during those years, is a little bit of the minutiae about his money problems, his money issues. And can get a bit conspiracy theory stuff about exactly connect all sorts of different connection things, but it's absolutely fascinating. It's a rabbit hole worth going down in detail. I wouldn't want to rush it. Right, I wouldn't want to try and rush through it all in the next 10 minutes.
You will be surprised at the very low quality. Well, you won't be, Bo, but some of the people in the audience might be surprised at some of the very low quality American publications that Winston Churchill was willing to write.
Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Like anyone who would pay him, basically.
I mean, anyone who knows much about Churchill in those years, or anyone a general knowledge thing about Churchill really, is that he always lived far beyond his means. The amount of money spent on things like cigars and booze, and gambling. I mean, it was common. I'm sure Aaron would say, and it's not wrong. It's common that people like that of that station and of that age lived in debt. I mean, that's common.
Yeah.
That's absolutely common. But still, that's still so. It is what it is. He never made enough money in those years. Not close.
But there were some fairly prominent people of particular religion / races who were supporting Winston Churchill in his wilderness years. Shall we say?
Who exactly gave him money and why?
Indeed. Yeah.
It's a
Well, look, if
question.
we're going to do a two-par on this, I think we need to leave the mid-late 30s for the second part
Okay.
with World War II, of course. But I will just say this one thing I wanted to mention about Winston Churchill. We've already talked about his enormous part in the 10-year rule, of restricting the British Armed Forces that was just extended year after year. Churchill mainly designed that. But when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer, one of the things he did, apart from taking Britain back onto the gold standard at a much too high rate, was he refused to give the Royal Navy enough money to finish the defences of the Singapore naval base, which in late 1941 and early 1942 is going to come back and haunt him, and even more importantly, the tens of thousands of British, Australian, and Indian soldiers who were captured by the Japanese. But yeah, again, Winston Churchill. When he was Chancellor of the Exchequer, he never recalled when he was First Lord of the Admiralty in charge of the Navy or War Minister and Air Minister. He never recalled these things when he was in a different department. It was, no, you can't have any money to finish your defences. And yet, in 1941, he will stand up in Parliament and say that Singapore is the Gibraltar of the Far East and it's completely impregnable. And he damn well knew that he stopped the Royal Navy spending the money to finish the defences. He knew this.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's like talking about the Iron Curtain that he negotiated in all sorts of ways. He was no economist. I've always thought it odd, ever since I was old enough to realise this in my teens, I suppose. I've always thought it odd. Wait, the Chancellor of Exchequer often, or nearly always, isn't a world-famous economist. Is that a good idea? So Churchill was yet another one in that tradition.
So far as I know, Churchill had no financial education whatsoever. I mean, he had about the same as me, which is nothing,
It doesn't necessarily follow that if you're terrible with your own finances, you can't understand fiscal policy. Those things don't follow. There's some good examples of people like that. But nonetheless, Churchill was bad with money.
All right, guys, we basically followed Winston's political career from 1900, when he first joins the House of Commons as a brand new MP, up to, let's say, I don't know, 1933 or so, about when my dad was born, pretty much. What's your final thoughts on his career so far?
Well, I would say it's a good place to stop, and we can pick up. Do you guys want to do this time next week?
Yeah, for sure.
It's a great place to pick up in 33, because when Mr. Hitler does get in, Churchill changes his tune profoundly at that moment, pretty much. So it's a good sort of sea change to sort of end on. I would say his career up to this point is. It's still remarkable. I'm not a fan. I think I've made it clear. I'm no fan, but it's a remarkable thing still, though.
But it almost entirely to the detriment of Britain, if you ask me. But...
Yeah, I mean, largely, right? It's not like he's an actual agent provocateur, right? At this point, it's not like he's actually trying to torpedo the empire as fast as possible, but. Yeah, you can't say he hasn't done great things, has he, for it?
Yeah, well, nearly everything he's done since he entered Parliament made Britain weaker.
Yeah, I mean, what does Aaron? What would Aaron say to
that? I would say that certainly a fascinating career, and he did damage Britain. But I would say that he was swimming in the direction to the political currents of the time. That he was, in many cases, the policies he was enacting was in government under prime ministers who endorsed that, and that I would argue that until he becomes Prime Minister in 1940, every decision he makes is a decision that is fundamentally the book fundamentally stops with the Prime Minister of the day, not him. He deserves some blame, but the Prime Minister of the day, particularly I would argue David Lloyd George in the post-war coalition government.
Well, David Lloyd George was a shitbag. I'll agree with that
Yeah.
for sure. He was an utter shitbag. But yeah.
Yeah.
I totally agree with that. David Lloyd George, I don't think he knew what honesty was, to be honest. That's a great chair you've got there, Bo, by the way. I've got to say, that is a nice chair.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm in the second studio at the Lotus Eaters, just round the corner from where I live. So
all right, guys.
It's better than the blank wall in my living room. So whenever I stream, I just come down here.
Yeah, cool, man. Cool. Look, guys, before we go, Bo, please plug anything you want to plug in terms of your YouTube channel and the Lotus Eaters or what have you. I will put links later on.
Thank you very much. Yeah, obviously my day job is working for the podcast of the Lotus Eaters, where I'm on the daily podcast there, but also got my own show, quote unquote show, called Epochs. But that is behind the paywall, so you have to pay £5 a month on the website of the Lotus Eaters to see that. I'm up to like 188 episodes of that. But then there is my own channel, History Bro, which is entirely free. I've got over 200 odd videos there. Everything from prehistory, Göbekli Tepe through to Dick Nixon.
The last thing I saw of yours, Bo, I think was something you did with Marcus Furious. That was pretty good.
Thank you. That's very kind. Yeah, the last thing up there is a 2-hour, 20-odd minute conversation with Furious Pertinax, aka Marcus, aka Iron Age agriculturalist. Talking about the early history of Rome, the early stuff from Aeneas through to Romulus and Remus, the kings and the Republic, up to sort of Pyrrhus, the wars of expansion in Italy, taking on the Samnites and the
where we get
sort of
Pyrrhic victories from. Yes,
right.
Yeah,
and
that was a good stream.
Thank you very much. And one other thing, I've got a new channel that we're trying to get off the ground with Nate from Mr. H Reviews, where again we're talking about history and politics. It's called The State of Politics. We're talking about history, philosophy, politics, that sort of thing. We're trying to literally get it off the ground, get the first 1,000 subs. And all that.
I just don't think you can do modern politics unless you have some idea of history. I really don't.
Right.
You have to understand that, because like if you're a British person, for example, as all three of us are, you can't talk about the modern British people unless you have some idea of what's been going on for the last 200, 500, 1,000 years. And in Britain, it's literally like British history is way over 1,000 years long in terms of Britain as a place.
Yeah. Well, I'd go back to the Bellbeaker people myself. Yeah, I'd go way back when.
No argument.
Yeah. So,
no
the small show there, The State of Politics. If people could sub for that would be much appreciated. Finally, you can find me on Twitter just under my real name, Bodade, where I'm very, very rude to leftists and globalists almost on the daily basis over there. So check that out.
Bo, send me on Twitter, please send me a link to your Lotus Eaters stuff and also your own channel stuff, and I will stick that up under this stream. Aaron,
Thank you.
Anything you would like to plug in terms of your channel and what have you?
Yes, starting last Sunday, I'm on my channel. I'm running an event where I'm reading the Ghost Stories of M.R. James, and this coming Sunday I'll be doing a live stream on my channel with my friend Sean and my friend Brandy, and also somebody who's a mutual of ours, Duke, Lady of Shalott, to discuss.
Lady of Shalott is excellent. Yeah.
And we're going to be discussing three particular for the past week, three ghost stories, which are Canon Elbrick's scrapbook, Count Magnus, and A Warning to the Curious, as well as their adaptations. So it should be interesting. That will be at 7 o'clock on Sunday evening UK time.
Cool. Like I said earlier, I've got a stream coming up with Aaron in the new year, which is going to be on the Jameson raid, which is pretty interesting.
Yeah, it's on the 29th of December.
There you go. 29. Actually, not the new year. This year.
Also, I should mention. Do you want to mention, Duke, about the one that we are doing in the new year?
That's it's in Luana and Rorke's Drift. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Go for it.
Yeah, so we'll be doing that on the 22nd of January 2025. That will be, I would imagine,
on the anniversary of the battles. Yeah,
that'll be at 9 o'clock, I should think, because you'll be all right with that, Duke, won't you? At 9 o'clock.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, no, I can do 9, no problem. All right, guys. Yeah, that would be good. Isan Luana, Rorke's Drift are quite interesting. Rorke's Drift, of course, is very famous. Isan Luana, slightly less so, but it was a bit of a disaster. But on the other hand, it was a really a disaster one can understand. There were only 600 British infantry there and 2 7-pounder muzzle loading guns against 25,000 Zulus. They were quite heavily outnumbered, shall we say. Oh, and there were a couple of hundred local South African volunteers and a few hundred African levies who had 1 rifle between 10 guys. So, yeah.
I did a long form bit of content about Asindawala and Rorke's Drift a little while back, talking about the film Zulu and Zulu Dawn as just a jump off point for them both. And it's a fantastic story. I absolutely love it. And what happens afterwards, where we do keep going. It's not the end of the story at Rorke's Drift, right? That's not the end of the story.
There's 9.
What happens after that? Yeah,
there's 9 battles altogether, and the British managed to lose 3 of them. But yeah,
there's honing the Zulu ultimately, though, right?
Oh, in the end, Battle of
taking him to London as a curiosity and stuff.
The Battle of Ulundi, we managed to win that. I've been to all those battlefields.
Have you?
Many of them several times. Like I've been to Isan Luana, I don't know, 20 times. Been to Rorke's Drift. I used to live 30 minutes motorcycle ride from Rorke's Drift, so I've been there. I don't know, 30 times at least. Sometimes with tour groups, but yeah, it's I look forward to doing that, Aaron. I also did a stream with Morgoth and Endeavour on their classic movies stream on Zulu 1960, and they have promised me I'm going to be on their Master and Commander stream, which I'm sure they're going to get around to eventually. Because that's my second favorite movie after Zulu. But yeah, guys, in the chat, thanks for joining us. Bo, Aaron Hook, thank you very much for joining us. We'll come back next week with part 2 of this, which I hope will not be quite so long. I think we can probably get that done in about an hour and a half, which is going to be basically Winston Churchill from about 1933 to 1945. But you will find, if you come and watch this stream, that the things we've already talked about Winston Churchill will keep coming up again and again. Like the stuff that's not pro-British, the stuff that is not going to make Britain a stronger, more powerful nation. This is the thing about Winston Churchill that gets me, is if you watch his political career, he constantly goes on the side of making Britain weaker. I mean, I'm not saying he even does it deliberately. Maybe he doesn't see it. I don't know. But, I don't think he was a stupid man. So I'm not sure. In many ways, I think he thought he was more American than British. He certainly liked his mother the most out of every other human in the world. He called her a fairy princess, and I have many ways of describing Jenny Jerome. Fairy princess ain't one of them, but okay. Anyway, guys, thank you for joining us. Thank you to my guests, Bo, History Bro and Aaron Hook, and in due course, there will be links to History Bro and Aaron Hook's channel under the stream. Go well, guys.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Okay, no, thank you. I'm going to chip off because I'm dog tired, but I really enjoyed that. Really enjoyed it. I'm looking forward to next week.
That is a great chair.
Oh, you know, yeah, we got more than one. There's for some reason, well, when we first started at Lotus Eaters, our main channel was monetized, and we had a bit of money to play with. And so we bought stuff like this, made this studio. We're demonetized now, and we struggle. The margins are very small. But at the beginning, we had a little bit of money, and I'm looking forward to next week because it really is the meat and veg, right, of Churchill talk.
Yeah, I like the beard. But I like the beard, by the way, Bo.
Oh, cheers!
Yeah, it's cool.
Cheers! Thank you very much.
I should just say we are still live.
Oh, are we?
Yes.
Oh, okay.